So, the title here, it's too effing late, I'm British, I couldn't possibly swear, my mum might be watching this later, but is it too late to solve the climate crisis? And what is the role of cities in averting what is now very clearly a climate crisis? And our role, the organisation that I represent, C40, we're an organisation of now nearly 100 of the world's greatest cities, mostly very large cities, big economies, but also some of the world's real green leaders, and a group of mayors that united on trying to tackle climate change together, spurring each other on to be more ambitious and to deliver against science-based targets, so starting from the basis of what science says is necessary to avert a climate crisis. So our starting point, actually, we're very much an adult organisation, an organisation of powerful people, of mayors, but actually the kids have been right in the last year. Those incredible kids led by Greta Thunberg with the school climate strikes, I think have pointed out something that the adults had missed, including professionals in the climate world. We'd convinced ourselves that the way to talk about climate change was climate change, not climate breakdown, not climate crisis, to focus on the wonderful new world that we are going to create, the tremendous opportunities from clean energy, all of which is true, but ignoring the fact that the emperor's not wearing any clothes, that actually we are in an emergency, that the entire future existence of humanity is now on the line, and that future of humanity will be decided by the decisions taken in just about the next 10 years, when we have a big opportunity, and particularly the mayors of big, powerful cities have a very big opportunity to influence that outcome. And that was really brought home to me. I've been on many of the school climate strikes all over the world. The one you can see on the screen here was in Oslo, and I was walking around with the governing mayor, Raymond Johansen, and this young girl put this placard in our faces, two men in their late youth, perhaps middle age, and she said, "You'll die of old age, but I'll die of climate change." And it really kind of brought home that when we talk about these terrible potential consequences in 2040, 2050, 2060, in our minds, it's something towards the end of our lives. And it's a scary consequence, but it's not the determining thing of our existence. If you're born in the 21st century, then it's about the prime of your life, or indeed the majority of your life, living in a world where human beings are struggling to exist. It was put slightly differently to me by another young climate striker in Paris, when he said that he was getting attacked in the media by journalists who were saying, "What right have you got, a 17-year-old kid, to be standing up and lecturing people, prime ministers, what to do about climate change? If you want to have that right, go to university, study climate science, and come back in 10 years and talk to us." And he said, "The only mandate that I need to stand up and talk about climate change is I was born in the 21st century. And this is my problem, and you're failing to solve it." So that's our starting point. This is a climate emergency. And it's not an emergency that's something we can see happening in the future. It's absolutely visibly an emergency right now. You can see that 1 degree of heating, so an increase in global average temperature of 1 degree above the pre-industrial average, is already creating a new climate reality across C40 cities. So in Lima, a city that's faced extraordinary floods and landslide, killing thousands of people, displacing tens of thousands more in the last few years, at a scale that they've never seen before. And I guess that's the thing here. There's always been flooding, but the scale is so different. Last year we saw in Cape Town, a major city that came very close to day zero, when they actually wouldn't have been able to provide drinking water to their population. They just managed to avert that. The rains came just in time. But around the world, 4 billion people live in places that suffer water stress at least 1 month in every year. And 500 million people live in places that have permanent drought, permanently have a lack of water compared to what United Nations agency said is necessary for humans to have a good existence. And then seeing that these are problems that don't just affect the poorer parts of the world, the global south, we saw the extraordinary impact of wildfires affecting some of the wealthiest and most famous people in the world in Los Angeles and across California last year. So we can completely see the impacts already of climate breakdown. The difficult truth is that if world leaders had acted 20 years ago, when the climate science was just as clear as it is today, and when they gathered together to create an international treaty to tackle climate breakdown, then the shift to a zero carbon world, to a climate safe world, wouldn't need to be so dramatic. Instead, as you can see on this graph here, in that 20-year period, almost 30 years now, emissions have increased by over 60%. And indeed, there was a slight tapering off a couple of years ago, but the emissions have started to go back up again in the latest data that we had last month. And so what we need now is, rather than a gradual reduction in emissions, an incredibly steep downward trajectory. Globally, emissions need to halve in the next 10 years. In a Western society like here in Denmark or across the whole of Europe, they need to cut by probably nearer to 2/3 in the next 10 years. Which means, in the words of Greta Thunberg, everything and everyone has got to change. And there is lots of good news. I promise this is not going to be an entirely bad news presentation. There's lots of positives to look at here, and on the bottom of this graph, the very nice steep upward trajectory in the proportion of energy that is now provided by renewables is notable. But look at what's happening to gas and to coal and to oil. We're doing a lot more of the good stuff, but we haven't stopped doing the bad stuff. We haven't stopped investing in prospecting for new fossil fuels, let alone reduced the actual quantities of fossil fuels that we're burning and the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. We are still going in the wrong direction, even though there are a lot more people that are dedicated to pushing us in the right direction. So when we look at this from the perspective of C40 and the world's big city mayors, what is it that we think that they can do? What contribution that they can play? And what message do they have to give to the rest of the world's leaders? Well, our starting point, it's a program in C40 called Deadline 2020, is that the first step has got to be to set the right target. So 3 years ago, C40's steering committee, an elected group of mayors, agreed that the target that C40 would take is that global average temperature rise needs to be constrained to no more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. That was about a few months after in Paris, the world governmental leaders had set on a target of no more than a 2 degrees rise. We looked at the science and decided that actually 1.5 was a more genuinely safe level, and last year the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out and confirmed that actually that is the right target, 1.5 degrees. Secondly, though, if one takes that target and takes the reality of a climate emergency, then climate action has got to move from being a peripheral issue to being the central organising principle of society, the central organising principle of government, the central organising principle of business, the central organising principle of how citizens see their role in society. And that's got a really strong expression recently in the United States with the concept of the Green New Deal. The person you can see on the screen here is Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, launching his new Deadline 20 compliant climate action plan a few weeks ago. I was out there with him in Los Angeles. This is a plan that has in the great city, North American city of Los Angeles, to reduce emissions by a half in the next decade. But it's not framed as an environmental plan, it's framed as an economic and political strategy for the city. At the heart of that plan is how they're going to create the good new green jobs, and not just net increase in jobs, but how the people who will lose their jobs in the gas-powered power stations that the mayor has now pledged to shut down within the next decade, how those precise workers are going to get great new jobs in the green economy. A just transition and a real focus on, alongside reducing carbon emissions, improving equity, improving quality of life for everyone, with an immediate focus on those who are most vulnerable and least well off. And that concept, I think, of a global, a Green New Deal in the United States In China, it's referred to as creating the ecological civilization. President Xi now refers to, rather than having a target for quantity of economic growth, instead their focus is an improvement in quality of economic development. Or inclusive climate action is how C40 is referred to it, but that putting climate and economy and equity together, united at the centre as a central organising principle of society. And that's why Oslo's climate budget is so inspirational, because what the mayor and his partners in government have done there is to absolutely put climate goals at the heart of policy making and financial planning by instituting a regime that there's a climate budget that sits alongside the financial budget each year. And indeed, the climate budget takes primacy. So it is not possible for the council to agree a financial budget if they can't prove that the way that they're going to spend money will reduce emissions in line with the plan, that 1.5 degree plan. And you can see that it's just from the direction of the graphs here, it's having some considerable success. One of the most forward-thinking cities in the whole of C40 now. So we need to get the right target. We need to make sure that climate change is not seen as a kind of issue to one side at the heart of government, but also then, of course, focusing on where there's the biggest potential for reducing emissions. And recognising here that the context here is big cities. So there may be some things here that seem like a surprising omission, not talking about agriculture or major energy generation, but here I'm focusing on what big city mayors can do. And there are three main areas that we focus on at the moment: getting to zero emission buildings by 2030, zero emission transport by 2030. We'd love to say zero emission waste by 2030, but that's a bit more difficult, and I'll come on to why. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of an example on each of them. So when we look across the whole of C40, something like 60% of emissions, when you measure it by what's produced within the geographical boundary of a city, comes from energy consumed in buildings. So clearly it's the most important area that we have to focus on. Our analysis shows that we need to get to all new buildings to be designed to be completely zero emission in operation by 2030, but also existing buildings, at least in the Western world, need to be comprehensively retrofitted so they're as close to zero emission as is technically feasible by 2030. There are now 20 or more cities in C40 that have committed to that regulatory change, that they will bring in the regulations that requires that from all development across their city and the retrofitting of their own public buildings as a start to shift global markets. One of the really strongest policies is in New York, just came into force a couple of months ago. Mayor de Blasio has brought in a building mandate that applies to 50,000 buildings across New York. And if that doesn't sound much in a city of over 8 million people, it's not any 50,000 buildings, it's the 50,000 largest buildings in New York, the skyscrapers of New York, which collectively amount to 60% of the floor space in that amazing city. And they are now required by law to massively reduce the emissions from those buildings. It's about a 40% reduction in the next decade, but with both the kind of regulatory imperative that requires that, but very substantial fines for those who fail to deliver. So to take one major landowner in New York at completely random, Donald Trump, he will face, for the 8 buildings that he owns in New York, fines of $2 million each year for failure to meet these regulations. And everybody I talked to in New York when Mayor de Blasio announced this policy last year said, it's a great idea, no way he'll ever get it through council. No possible way he can get a political alliance for that. It was passed with only 2 votes against in the end, and bringing in a lot of the real estate community behind the policy. Secondly, zero emission transport by 2030. So the concept that we won't have any fossil fuel powered vehicles on our streets by 2030. Now this seems an almost impossible context, even when you look out in the streets in Copenhagen. But there are a few cities in C40, not quite publicly yet, but are putting together serious policy for how they will achieve that. What we currently have as a standard in C40 that almost 30 of our cities have committed to, that at least a very major area of the city will be completely free of fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2030, and as a starting point, as a kind of indicator of going on that path, that our cities will stop procuring fossil fuel powered buses and get to fully electric or zero emission bus fleets by 2030. And this is an area where we can see real progress. It's an area where mayors have some real power, starting in China. So actually almost all of our Chinese member cities will have fully electric bus fleets, thousands of vehicles, 16,000 in the case of Shenzhen, fully electric bus fleets within the next 12 months, not by 2030. But for the rest of the world, the biggest electric bus fleet outside of China, 16,000 electric buses in Shenzhen in one city, just over 200 in Santiago. There's about the same in London. That's the next biggest. This is absolutely a Chinese success story at the moment, but 99% of the electric buses in the world in operation are in China. 95% of the buses in operation anywhere were manufactured in China. This is something that's really been stimulated. But alongside that shift in electric vehicles, of course, we also need policies that encourage and incentivize people to walk and to cycle, as so many people do in Copenhagen, to use public transport, and that means making it fast and accessible and cheap and going on the routes that people need. And I'm really proud that in my home city in London, we've been a real leader in that, using the stick of congestion charging drivers to come into the centre of London, which has now been extended to an ultra-low emission zone, and there's thinking about extending that across the whole of the city, along with a massive investment in buses and a reduction and freezing of public transport fares that led to a huge shift out of cars, a reduction in the number of people driving and a significant increase in the number of people using public transport. So thirdly, and the one that I said at the start was the most difficult, is getting to zero emission waste. So zero waste going to landfill, zero waste being incinerated, and a massive reduction in the total quantity of products that become waste. So the concept of the circular economy, designing things so that they can be reused, so that a whole product doesn't have to be thrown away because one component breaks down. The reason this is difficult is not because there's a technological barrier. Indeed, there are some cities in C40 that are quite close to this already. San Francisco is 75-80% recycling rate already, and will most certainly get to zero emission waste by 2030. There's some other targets involved in that for us, is to reduce the total quantity of waste by half by 2030 and the per person waste by 15%. And San Francisco will probably get there. The problem comes in a place like Jakarta, where quite simply the waste isn't even collected in full at the moment. And this is a real existential problem for many cities in Africa and in South Asia in particular. Jakarta is perhaps the most extreme. You can see here one of the three main rivers flowing through Jakarta, and you can see that it is just absolutely full of plastic. So full of waste, in fact, that the city is unable to use their rivers, even with cleansing processes, to use that water to convert into potable drinking water. And so they are entirely reliant on using the aquifers under the city to provide that water. The result of that is Jakarta is sinking 7 centimetres each year. It's sinking just as the sea levels are rising. 40% of the central business district of Jakarta now lies below sea level, but the projection is within 10 years' time that will be 80%. So if they're the kind of three main areas where we've been focused on and where we really want to direct energy, our calculation is if you can deliver on those three big goals, you get about 90% of the way to reducing emissions by half in C40 cities by 2030. But one of the real lessons that we've learnt in working with mayors across the C40 cities is that tinkering with the market won't stop climate breakdown. We need entrepreneurial governments, which is the concept of Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, which means
that rather than governments seeing that their role is just to correct market failure when it happens, but instead that what governments at city and national level should be doing is actively creating and shaping markets for the products and services that we need to avoid climate breakdown. And we've already seen this in practice, looking at the images on the slide. In China, we've seen how city governments ignored what the European and North American bus manufacturers were telling them, that fully electric bus fleets just weren't possible for some decades, and instead invested themselves to create fully electric bus fleets. We've also seen it in Germany, where the government has incentivized homeowners to put solar panels on their roofs, with a huge shift in renewable energy generation as a result. And perhaps a more surprising example, but we've seen it in the smartphone industry. We all think of the genius of Steve Jobs and Apple of creating the smartphone, but in fact, it was the US government's investment that created the internet. It was US government investment that created global positioning satellites, without which you couldn't have smartphones. And even the touchscreen phone was created through investment from the US government. So what we require is value-led policy making and entrepreneurial government that abandons the failed dogma of neoliberalism, or neoclassical economics, if you want to put it like that. The idea that markets can solve everything. We've seen conclusively with the impact of climate change that just doesn't work. Instead, there still is a big role for the private sector, but we're moving now into an era where the pursuit of profit as the sole motivation for doing anything just is no longer acceptable. Instead, in our era of climate emergency, we need mission-driven businesses that are working hand in hand with entrepreneurial governments to avoid climate breakdown.
The reason we really need to focus on these kind of theoretical, how does government run, how does business run, is we've just got to move incredibly fast. And as an example of the kind of pace and scale of change that has to be achieved, this is a map of the United States in 2007 and China in 2007, and high-speed rail connections lines. And if you think you're too far away from the screen and can't see the lines, you're not. There was no high-speed rail in either country in 2007. This is what it looks like in 2019. There's still 0 kilometers in the United States, or they've got a bit planned in California. 29,000 kilometers of high-speed rail have been built in China in that time. The vast majority through public investment, built by private sector firms from around the world, but with a whole new industries now created in China. And that dramatically, when we project forward, for example, about patterns of flying and aviation across cities, this dramatically changes the projections in these two countries, because now people in China are able to move great distances at great speed without needing to fly, whereas our friends in the United States still, if they want to have meetings person to person across states, they've got to jump on a plane. There's no other way of doing it. We need that kind of pace and scale of change applied to everything, to zero emission buildings, to zero emission transport, to zero emission waste. And here's my kind of final point here, and obviously I am speaking to my bosses here, to the mayors that we work for, but also it is true. We can't wait for presidents and prime ministers to solve the climate crisis. With the best will in the world, there is going to be no way forward from the intergovernmental organisations on the climate crisis in the next few years. As long as President Trump remains in the White House, but also Bolsonaro in Brazil, the newly elected coal-mad government in Australia, we just don't have the leaders at the international level. Our best bet for humanity, from the point of view of political leadership, is that mayors around the world will take responsibility, not just for delivering in their own cities, but for forming and supporting the coalition of business and citizens that will avert a climate emergency, and will turn it into that positive vision of a low carbon, prosperous, equitable society that all of us are committed to achieve. And that's the big focus that we want to have on the C40 summit in Copenhagen in October, and very much looking forward to all of your input and how we can achieve that goal. Thanks very much.